George Wallace, a politician of controversy and shock. George Wallace, the former governor of Alabama, remains one of the most polarizing figures in American political history. Known primarily for his staunch segregationist stance during the Civil Rights Movement, his political journey is riddled with controversies, shocking actions, and unexpected turns. Here are 10 of the most shocking and scandalous facts about George Wallace, each providing insight into the complexities of his public and private life. Fact number 1. Early life and background of George Wallace. George Corley Wallace was born on August 25, 1919, in Clio, Alabama. He was the eldest of 4 children in a Methodist family, with his father being a farmer and his mother named Moselle Smith. His rural upbringing in southeastern Alabama had a profound impact on his early interest in politics and his future political career. At the age of 10, Wallace's political interests were sparked when he won a contest to serve as a page in the Alabama Senate, and he confidently predicted he would one day be governor. This ambition was indicative of his early understanding of political power dynamics. Wallace also engaged in boxing during his high school years, becoming a regionally successful bantamweight fighter. This aspect of his youth may have shaped his later combative political style. After high school, he attended the University of Alabama School of Law, graduating in 1942, and briefly served in the military during World War II, where he contracted and nearly died from spinal meningitis. Wallace was married 3 times. His first wife, Lurleen Burns Wallace, succeeded him as governor after his term was up. His subsequent marriages to Cornelia Snively and Lisa Taylor both ended in divorce. He had 4 children, including a son, George Wallace Jr. Number 2. Segregation now, segregation forever. On January 14, 1963, during his inaugural speech as the governor of Alabama, George Wallace delivered one of the most infamous declarations in the history of American civil rights conflicts. At the Alabama state capitol, with a large crowd and in an address broadcasted to a wider audience, he stated, "Segregation now, segregation tomorrow, segregation forever." This vow, crafted by his speechwriter Asa Earl Carter, who was a known segregationist and member of the Ku Klux Klan, was not merely rhetorical but a firm commitment to his pro-segregation platform, marking his resistance to federal integration efforts and solidifying his status as a segregationist icon. This speech echoed throughout the civil rights movement, becoming a rallying cry for both supporters and opponents of segregation. Number 3. Stand in the schoolhouse door. On June 11, 1963, in a dramatic showdown broadcasted nationally, George Wallace physically positioned himself in the doorway of Foster Auditorium at the University of Alabama in Tuscaloosa to block the entry of 2 African-American students, Vivian Malone and James Hood. This was a direct challenge to the federal mandate following a court order issued by Judge Harlan Grooms, which required the university to desegregate. Wallace's stand ended when Deputy Attorney General Nicholas Katzenbach, accompanied by federal marshals and the Alabama National Guard under General Henry Graham's command, compelled him to step aside, thus allowing the students to register for classes. The event was a pivotal moment in the American civil rights movement and significantly raised Wallace's national profile as a symbol of segregation. Number 4. Assassination attempt and paralysis. While campaigning for the Democratic presidential nomination on May 15, 1972, in Laurel, Maryland, George Wallace was shot 5 times by Arthur Bremer, a 21-year-old busboy with a troubled past and obsessions with fame and political assassination. The bullet struck Wallace's abdomen and chest, severing his spinal cord, which resulted in permanent paralysis from the waist down. The severe injuries he sustained forced Wallace to use a wheelchair for the remainder of his life and subtly shifted his perspective on various political issues, including civil rights. This incident not only marked a tragic turn in his life but also led to a re-evaluation of his views on race and segregation in later years. Number 5. Surprising apology to the black community. Late in his life, George Wallace made public apologies to the African American community, a move that contrasted sharply with his earlier vehement pro-segregation stance. His first significant public apology came in 1979, during his last term as governor. Then, in a 1982 political meeting, he took a more poignant step by expressing regret before black civil rights leaders for his past actions and policies. Wallace's apologies were seen by some as genuine remorse and by others as a calculated political maneuver to soften his historical image and appeal to a broader voter base, especially as he had come to garner significant support from black voters during his final term in office, which was marked by an unprecedented number of African American political appointments in Alabama. Number 6. 4 terms as governor. George Wallace's political career as Alabama's governor is marked by his election for 4 terms, 1963, 1967, 1971, and 1983. His initial term started on January 14, 1963, during which he made his infamous commitment to segregation. He was re-elected in 1967 and again in 1971, each time showcasing his ability to adapt his political strategies to maintain support despite the changing national sentiments on race and civil rights. After a gap during which his wife, Lurleen Wallace, served because state law barred him from consecutive terms, and following an unsuccessful bid in the 1978 elections, he won his final term in 1983. During this term, he made a significant shift towards racial reconciliation, appointing a record number of African Americans to governmental positions. Number 7. Influential presidential campaigns. Wallace ran for president 4 times. In the 1964 Democratic primaries, he showed surprising strength in the North, indicating broader national appeal than many had expected. His most successful bid was in 1968 as a third-party candidate for the American Independent Party, where he captured approximately 9.9 million votes, 13.5% of the popular vote, and carried 5 southern states. His campaign appealed particularly to those who felt alienated by the civil rights advancements of the 1960s. In 1972, as a Democratic candidate again, he was one of the front-runners before being shot and paralyzed, which significantly affected his campaign. Number 8. The shift from Democrat to Independent. George Wallace's decision to run as an independent in the 1968 presidential election was a significant pivot from his Democratic roots. This move was catalyzed by his belief that neither the Democratic nor Republican parties were sufficiently addressing the concerns of conservative voters, particularly around states' rights and opposition to federal civil rights legislation. In February 1968, Wallace formed the American Independent Party, positioning it as a middle ground for those disillusioned with the traditional two-party system. His campaign appealed to a segment of the electorate that felt alienated by the rapid social changes of the 1960s, advocating for law and order and a return to what he termed American values. Wallace's platform resonated particularly in the South, where there was significant opposition to desegregation. Number 9. FBI surveillance. George Wallace was under FBI surveillance starting in the early 1960s, a monitoring intensified by his provocative and often incendiary rhetoric on race and federal authority. The FBI maintained extensive files on Wallace, tracking his movements, speeches, and political engagements. This surveillance was part of a broader effort by the agency to keep tabs on figures who could potentially incite civil unrest. The files on Wallace included communications, internal memos, and reports detailing his interactions and the reactions they provoked across different states. This level of scrutiny was indicative of the federal government's concern over his ability to mobilize dissent against civil rights advancements. Number 10. Controversial support and opposition. During his 1968 presidential run, George Wallace garnered support from various right-wing and extremist groups, including an endorsement from the Ku Klux Klan. However, aware of the negative implications such associations could have on his broader electoral prospects, particularly outside the Deep South, Wallace publicly disavowed these endorsements. Despite his disavowal, his campaign continued to appeal to voters with segregationist sympathies, reflecting the polarized views of the era. His rhetoric and policies attracted considerable support but also sparked significant opposition from civil rights groups and more liberal segments of the populace, highlighting the divisive nature of his political influence.